The city of Thalassa was a miracle of ancient magic, standing proudly on the ocean floor, shielded from the crushing weight of the deep by a continuous magical dome. This perfect equilibrium was maintained by the ritual of tides, a continuous spell powered by two opposing, yet essential, elemental mages. We meet Kael, the Tide Master, his spirit as fluid and restless as the blue water magic he commanded, and Rhys, the Stonekeeper, whose deep green earth magic gave the city its unyielding structure and stability. They stood at the city's core, before the altar of equilibrium, performing the ritual that sustained life. Kael and Rhys were fated rivals. Kael, adaptable and impatient, often chafed at Rhys's rigid control. Rhys, methodical and stubborn, saw Kael's constant flux as dangerous volatility. Yet, their conflict was necessary. The flow of water balanced the structure of Earth, creating the stable membrane of the dome. Their synchronization was purely professional, a tense, continuous spell that could not fail. "Maintain the pressure, Stonekeeper," Kael commanded, his voice sharp with focus as his water barrier pulsed around the altar. "Hold your speed, Tidemaster," Rhys countered, his tone clipped as he meticulously anchored the altar with shifting crystal earth. Stability requires rhythm, not a torrent. Their powers flowed together, a tense harmony of opposing forces, and the dome remained bright and strong. But the sea holds dangers older than Thalassa itself. An insidious anti-magic decay known as the Shadow Plague had breached the outer defenses. A tendril of the oily, deep black shadow magic struck the altar of equilibrium, instantly severing the delicate psychic link that held Kael and Rhys's powers in sync. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Kael's flowing blue water magic, no longer synchronized with Rhys's structure, violently repelled the earth magic. Rhys's structured earth magic violently resisted Kael's flow. The dome's structural integrity immediately failed. The exterior sea pressure intensified, and the city's foundation began to buckle. If Kael and Rhys's full powers were to accidentally collide now, if they so much as touch their raw elements together, the repulsion would shatter the dome, burying the city under a torrent of water and rock. The Elder's frantic magical projection flashed across the altar. "The synchronization is lost. The dome will fail in 6 hours. You must repair the central conduit." Kael and Rhys, the fated rivals, were now facing their impossible test. They had to achieve perfect synchronization, not through professional routine, but through genuine harmony, all while their very elements screamed in mutual magical repulsion. Thalassa's last breath depended on two people who fundamentally clashed, finding a way to work together without ever letting their powers actually touch. Welcome to Thalassa, where life hangs by a thread. I'm thrilled you're here for the Sunken City's last breath. This story is all about the impossible balance between two rivals, the flowing water and the stable stone, whose perfect harmony is the only thing keeping the ocean from crushing their world. Before we dive into their desperate race against the clock, I want to hear from you. 1. Hit that like button if you love stories where the whole city's fate rests on two people who hate each other. 2. Tell me in the comments, if you could choose one elemental power, water, flow, or earth, structure, which would you pick and why? All right, the dome is cracking, the elements are repelling, and the sea is waiting. Let's get back to Kael and Rhys before Thalassa is truly lost. Chapter 1. The chilling, high-pitched shriek of the altar of equilibrium's failure was instantly followed by the city's urgent warning klaxons. Kael, the Tidemaster, and Rhys, the Stonekeeper, abandoned the crumbling altar, their faces grim. They rushed through the crystalline corridors of Thalassa, their focus singular, reaching the royal archives where the ancient scrolls detailing the altar's repair ritual were stored. They reached a wide, circular corridor designed to withstand typical tremors. But the magical feedback from their severed link was far worse than a tremor. As they ran, a section of the outer wall, the part directly reinforced by Rhys's earth magic, groaned and shuddered. The pressure from the external ocean, no longer balanced by the ritual, found the weakness. A fissure suddenly spiderwebbed across the crystalline dome, and with a violent burst, the seal broke. A torrent of seawater, Kael's element, cold and crushing, blasted through the fissure, slamming into the corridor and rushing toward the Royal Archives door. Kael instinctively flung his hands out, trying to contain the water, but the repulsion was instant. His water magic, now chaotic and uncontrolled, twisted the torrent into a wildly unpredictable geyser, worsening the breach. Simultaneously, the floor beneath them, which relied on Kael's fluid balancing pressure, violently buckled. Rhys's earth magic, now deprived of the water's complementary flow, instantly overcompensated for the structural stress. With a deafening grinding sound, the entire floor of the corridor rose up in a jagged, chaotic wave of crystalline rock and earth. The rising rock successfully shored up the floor, but it sealed the only passage leading to the archives, trapping their exit. Rhys's attempt at immediate stability had trapped them completely. Kael spun around, shouting over the din of rushing water and grinding rock. "Rhys, you sealed us in! I can't contain the leak if we can't get to the plans!" "I stabilized the foundation, Tidemaster," Rhys retorted, his face rigid with professional discipline. "Your uncontrolled flow destabilized the archway. If I hadn't made an immediate structure, we would have been crushed before we even reached the archives." They stood trapped in the flooded, trembling corridor, their efforts to survive only confirming the catastrophic opposition of their powers. Kael's element was flooding their exit, and Rhys's element was sealing their doom. Their immediate actions to save themselves had created an impossible, lethal trap. Trapped in the flooded corridor, with the Royal Archives visible but inaccessible behind the wall of rock, Kael and Rhys immediately moved to clear their respective obstacles. Their solutions were reflexive, embodying their fundamental conflict. Kael, the Tidemaster, focused on the rock barrier sealing their exit. His instinct was speed and force, the swift removal of the problem. He began channeling his water magic, intending to unleash a high-pressure jet, not to break the earth magic, but to erode a path through the crystalline structure Rhys had created. "Step aside, Stonekeeper! I'll cut a channel through your prison!" Kael shouted, his hands glowing bright blue. However, Rhys's earth magic, now magically repelled by Kael's flow, reacted violently to the presence of the powerful water magic. The crystalline rock instantly hardened and amplified its rigidity and defense, becoming denser and more impenetrable the closer Kael's water came. Kael's forceful jet slammed against the enhanced barrier, splashing violently back and increasing the floodwater, failing to make a dent. "Your blunt force only makes my structure stronger," Rhys snapped, stepping in front of the rock wall. "You think you can blast stability? You just solidified the obstacle." Seeing Kael's failure, Rhys, the Stonekeeper, moved toward the breach in the outer wall. His instinct was methodical, permanent structure. He began channeling his earth magic into the jagged, crystalline fissure, intending to meticulously reinforce the edges and then weave a permanent crystal plate to seal the leak. "You failed to contain the flood, Tidemaster. I will seal the breach permanently," Rhys muttered, his deep green magic pulsing slowly as he attempted to form an unyielding plate. However, Kael's water magic, now magicked repelled by Rhys's static structure, reacted with equal hostility. The flowing floodwater surrounding the fissure suddenly grew highly unstable and turbulent in resistance to Rhys's attempt to impose rigidity. The violent currents slammed into the edges of Rhys's forming crystal plate, microfracturing the structure and preventing the rigid seal from forming properly. Rhys cried out in frustration as his meticulously crafted crystal plate shattered under the erratic water pressure. "Your volatility is destroying my anchor. I can't build stability when your element is screaming in opposition to my presence." They retreated, breathing heavily. Kael's speed sabotaged Rhys's structure. Rhys's rigidity sabotaged Kael's flow. They had confirmation of the devastating constraint. Any attempt to solve a problem using their natural, elementally opposed methods resulted in instant magical sabotage, consuming precious time and worsening the overall structural integrity of the city. Their survival demanded a solution that defied their elemental nature. Chapter 2. After using a neutral, non-magical explosive charge to clear the rock barrier and retrieve the repair scrolls, Kael and Rhys agreed to split their efforts. They needed to stabilize the dome's structural weaknesses immediately before attempting the complex altar repair. Rhys, the stonekeeper, took the task of stabilizing a critical dome support column near the seabed foundation, a task that required absolute structural rigidity. Rhys knelt at the base of the massive crystalline support column. The column was groaning under the immense external sea pressure, no longer eased by the subtle counterpressure of the synchronization ritual. Rhys channeled his deepest earth magic, a deep green light, into the failing crystal, attempting to force new layers of rigid, unbreakable structure to form. He worked with methodical, focused intensity, the epitome of the stonekeeper. But the moment he established a dense layer of defense, the sheer, unbalanced pressure from the ocean outside, combined with the magical repulsion now inherent in the environment, stressed the new earth structure. The crystalline plating he formed would hold for a minute, then snap and fissure with audible cracks, failing faster than he could repair it. Rhys cried out in frustration. "It won't hold. The rigidity is not enough. Without the flow to ease the tension, the structure is brittle." The truth of the elemental dependency was stark. Structure needs flow. Without Kael's water magic to distribute the load and create a subtle balancing counterforce, Rhys's pure rigidity became its own weakness, breaking under the strain. The problem was not his technique. The problem was Kael's absence. Rhys was forced to acknowledge the only person who could help was the one person whose magic was magically hostile to his own. He looked toward the deep ocean, where the blackness hinted at the crushing weight above them. "Tide Master!" Rhys projected mentally, his tone clipped but desperate. "The structure is failing. I require aid, but your element cannot touch my creation." Kael, observing from a safer distance, understood. They couldn't synchronize directly to repair the dome. They had to synchronize through the environment itself. The water element had to support the structure without ever touching the earth element. Kael's mind, naturally fluid and adaptable, seized the idea. He focused not on the structure's defense, but on the pressure's offense. Receiving Rhys's strained mental appeal, Kael didn't hesitate. He knew he couldn't touch the crumbling support column or the crystalline plating Rhys was fighting to form. His water magic would only repel the earth magic, shattering the entire structure instantly. Synchronization had to be achieved through an invisible, environmental intermediary. Kael channeled his pure, bright blue water magic not into the city, but outward, into the dark, crushing ocean surrounding the dome. He used his power to create a massive, high-velocity countercurrent flowing just centimeters above the support column Rhys was trying to repair. This current was entirely Kael's element, but it was positioned to directly oppose the natural, unrelenting pressure of the deep sea. The effect was instantaneous. By generating a fluid shield of counterpressure, Kael subtly but effectively lessened the physical stress bearing down on Rhys's structure from the outside. Rhys, focused intently on stabilizing the failing column, felt the sudden, inexplicable relief of the external strain. His earth magic, which had been fracturing under the unbalanced load, now found the necessary stability. With the pressure subtly equalized by Kael's external flow, the crystalline structure finally held. Rhys was able to successfully weave new layers of rigid support into the column, solidifying the dome's defense. Kael's action was the perfect example of indirect synchronization. Flow supported structure not by merging, but by neutralizing the external conflict so the structure could stand. Rhys released his magic, exhausted but successful. He projected a brief, begrudging acknowledgement to Kael. The current held, efficiency noted, Tidemaster. Kael felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. They had taken their first step toward harmony, realizing that their combined success lay in understanding their element's fundamental needs. Structure needs the world to stop pressing, and flow can make the world stop pressing. Their survival depended on respecting the repulsion and working entirely through the environment, as two sides of a single, functional system. Chapter 3. With the dome's structural integrity temporarily stabilized by their indirect coordination, Kael and Rhys moved deeper into the city's network. Their next objective was the central energy manifold, a crucial hub that distributed the ritual power, now severely stressed by the elemental dissonance, to the altar of equilibrium. They reached the manifold chamber, a vast space crisscrossed by ancient glowing power conduits. The main conduit, a thick artery of crystallized energy, was beginning to fail. Its structure was shuddering, threatening to shear off and cause a catastrophic energy backflow. This was primarily a structural problem, falling under Rhys's domain, but it demanded Kael's adaptability. Kael, the Tidemaster, immediately channeled his water magic to the conduit. His fluid nature suggested absorbing the stress by encasing the conduit in a sheath of high-tension liquid magic, allowing the flow of energy to continue while cushioning the failing material. "The conduit needs to move," Kael projected urgently. "I'll surround it with a tension sheath to absorb the vibration. Don't touch it." However, Rhys, the Stonekeeper, saw only Kael's fluid magic threatening the very existence of the conduit's structural material. To Rhys's rigid, methodical mind, movement was instability, and instability was failure. His instinct was to provide immediate, unyielding structure. Before Kael could complete his liquid sheath, Rhys lashed out with his earth magic. He instantly forced the crystalline structure around the failing conduit to freeze, turning the area into a block of hard, unmoving rock. "I need stability, not fluidity," Rhys countered, his face grim. "If it moves, it breaks." Rhys's quick, rigid action successfully stopped the vibration, but it had a disastrous consequence. The rigid, crystalline block severed the necessary power flow to the altar. The sudden, absolute structural integrity had choked the energy current. Kael's bright blue liquid magic, unable to penetrate the thick, unyielding, rigid wall of Rhys's green earth magic, snapped back violently in repulsion. The energy to the altar flickered and died. They had stopped the structural damage, but had inadvertently caused a major power failure, leaving the altar repair impossible until the flow was restored. "You fool!" Kael roared, stepping back from the backlash. "You've killed the flow! We can't synchronize the altar if there's no power reaching it. Your obsession with rigidity just destroyed the connection." Rhys stood rigid before his crystallized block, his own face etched with the realization of his error. He had instinctively prioritized stability, but in doing so, he had blocked the very essence of Kael's nature, movement, and crippled their mission. The rigid structure was perfect, but it was perfectly useless. The power failure was absolute. Rhys stood before his rigid wall of crystallized earth, the perfect structure he had created now serving as the perfect obstruction. Kael's furious rejection of his rigidity finally broke through Rhys's stubborn pride. He realized his focus on stability was worthless if it choked the very flow that gave the city life. Rhys took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing himself to suppress his core, elemental instinct, rigidity. He slowly began to soften the immense structural pressure he had placed on the crystalline block. He wasn't dissolving it entirely, but channeling his earth magic to achieve a state he had always despised, malleable structure. He consciously introduced flexibility into the crystal lattice, making the stone yielding, not unyielding. "Tidemaster," Rhys projected, his voice strained by the effort of compromising his nature. "I yield the block. Flow, but respect the boundary." Kael, observing Rhys's agonizing retreat from absolute rigidity, understood the concession. He knew he couldn't simply blast the water through, he had to use flow to support a structure. Kael channeled his water magic, not as a torrent, but as a high-tension, highly organized liquid web. He began to weave a high-tension liquid lattice, a self-contained, flowing framework designed to cradle the crystalline conduit without touching the brittle power-carrying core. He used his water to form a strong, fluid sheath around Rhys's flexible crystal, creating a separate channel for the energy current to pass through. The moment Kael's flowing lattice connected with Rhys's newly malleable structure, the magical repulsion vanished. Instead of fighting, the two elements interlocked. Rhys's flexible structure held the shape and containment, while Kael's fluid lattice provided the pressure and movement necessary for the power to flow. They created a temporary composite conduit, a successful synchronization built on compromise. The Earthkeeper had sacrificed rigidity, and the Tidemaster had sacrificed speed for disciplined form. A warm, steady current of energy immediately began flowing back toward the altar of equilibrium. They both stood, exhausted. They had achieved a temporary synchronization not by merging, but by respecting the function of the other element. They realized their rivalry was a self-imposed prison. Their elements were designed to complement, not conflict. "It holds," Kael projected, his tone quieter, respectful. "The flow is stable, Stonekeeper." "Only because you accepted form," Rhys responded, his voice equally subdued. "And only because I allowed movement." They had restored the power flow, but the synchronization was fragile, requiring continuous, exhausting concentration to maintain the complex composite element. They still needed the ultimate repair ritual at the altar. Chapter 4. Maintaining the composite conduit required grueling concentration, draining both Kael and Rhys as they made their way back to the center of Thalassa. When they reached the altar of equilibrium, the sight confirmed their worst fears. The shadow plague had returned for a final catastrophic assault. The altar chamber was shrouded in a toxic, oily darkness. Massive tendrils of the black anti-magic decay were actively and violently shattering the central ritual conduit, the nexus where the water and earth elements were meant to harmonize. The dome's warning klaxons were screaming a continuous, unbroken note, indicating critical structural failure was minutes away. The Elder's final message flashed across the ruined altar. "Full synchronization is required now. Channel all power into the core conduit simultaneously. Failure will result in immediate implosion." Kael and Rhys stood on opposite sides of the altar, their faces grim. They understood the demand. They needed to channel their maximum, total power into the core conduit at the exact same frequency to purge the plague and re-establish the permanent, life-sustaining ritual link. However, the shadow plague had done its work. The moment they stood ready to channel their power, the magical repulsion between them, flow versus structure, was amplified by the encroaching darkness. Kael's water magic flared with aggressive, volatile energy. Rhys's earth magic pulsed with rigid, defensive tension. The raw power of their elements, when pushed to maximum, was violently repelling. If they channeled their full individual power into the same small nexus, their hostile elements would collide and detonate the altar, instantaneously shattering the dome from the center outward. The fragile compromise of the liquid lattice was not powerful enough for this final, annihilating ritual. "We can't do it!" Kael shouted over the noise, his hands trembling with the effort of containment. "If I push my full flow into the core, your structure will collapse instantly. It's mutual destruction. And if I reinforce the core with enough structure, your water will turn into an uncontrollable pressure weapon and destroy the conduit." Rhys countered, his body rigid with fear and desperate concentration. The shadow plague tendrils sensed their agonizing conflict and writhed closer, feeding on the dissonance, ready to consume the altar. Kael and Rhys had run out of time and compromises. They needed a new element, a unified solution that transcended the natural rivalry of water and earth. Standing opposite each other at the besieged altar, their elements screaming in repulsion, Kael and Rhys had a flash of terrifying clarity. Their rivalry, flow versus structure, was the cause of the dome's destruction. They couldn't push their elements as opponents. They had to channel them as components of a single, unified whole. Kael, the Tide Master, looked at the earth Rhys controlled. Rhys, the Stonekeeper, looked at the water Kael commanded. They realized the elemental solution lay not in their separate purities, but in their perfect, intentional combination. Mire, or silt, the blend of fine earth and controlled water. Mire was neither purely fluid nor purely rigid. It was malleable, yet self-contained and perfectly balanced. "We don't channel water or earth," Kael projected, his voice ringing with sudden, desperate insight. "We channel the medium between us. We channel mire." Rhys immediately understood the profound compromise required. To create mire, he had to make his earth incredibly fine and perfectly permeable, sacrificing all his innate rigidity. Kael had to make his water incredibly fine and perfectly contained, sacrificing all his innate momentum. With a silent, shared look of absolute final resolve, they began the ultimate synchronization. Rhys channeled his full power, transforming the dense crystalline earth magic into an enormous mass of perfectly malleable, fine silt. He focused on achieving perfect structure, the ability to hold a shape, but willingly yield to pressure. His green light faded to a soft, sandy brown. Kael channeled his full power, transforming the turbulent water magic into an equal mass of perfectly contained, finely controlled liquid. He focused on achieving perfect flow, the ability to move completely but willingly hold its boundary. His blue light faded to a translucent, contained brown. The two masses of brown gold, unified magic flowed inward, no longer repelling, but embracing to create a single, powerful wave of mire. This unified element represented the perfect balance of their rivalry, structure that allowed flow and flow that respected structure. The unified mire surged into the shattered altar conduit. The anti-magic shadow plague, unable to feed on the dissonance of a perfectly balanced composite element, shrieked and recoiled as the pure, balanced force of mire washed over it. The altar core healed instantly, the magical conduit snapping into place with a blinding flash of brown gold light. Kael and Rhys collapsed simultaneously, utterly drained, their individual elements exhausted, but the ritual link was permanently, perfectly restored. The dome's warning klaxons fell silent. Thalassa was safe. Chapter 5. The powerful surge of the unified mire element, the perfectly contained and malleable fusion of water and earth, enveloped the shattered nexus of the altar of equilibrium. The anti-magic shadow plague could not resist this balanced force. Where the plague thrived on dissonance and opposition, the mire was pure harmony. The black, oily tendrils shrieked a silent magical alarm and rapidly recoiled, shriveling and burning away from the clean brown gold light emanating from the altar core. The source of the city's instability was completely purified and driven from the central ritual site. As the mire surged into the fractured conduit, it acted as the perfect magical solder. The fine, contained flow filled every micro-fissure, and the malleable structure hardened just enough to establish a permanent, integral link between the water and earth magical pathways. The core conduit was instantly repaired and stabilized. The moment the link snapped into place, the ritual of tides automatically reactivated, powered by the immense magical reserves of Thalassa's foundation. The continuous, life-sustaining synchronization was instantly and permanently re-established, now flowing through the unified mire element. The city responded immediately. The immense crushing pressure of the deep sea, which had been pressing relentlessly on the city, was subtly, magically equalized. The final, alarming cracks that had spiderwebbed across the main dome vanished, sealing themselves with glowing crystal as the balanced pressure allowed the structure to mend. The high-pitched klaxons throughout Thalassa finally fell silent, replaced by the low, steady, reassuring hum of a stable magical barrier. Kael and Rhys collapsed onto the floor, utterly spent, their individual elemental reserves temporarily depleted by the immense, unified channel they had created. The terrifying period of dissonance was over. The physical threat was neutralized. They lay on opposite sides of the humming altar, separated by a thin sheen of cooling, solidifying mire. Exhausted, they were connected not by a shared hatred or grudging necessity, but by the profound, shared experience of having achieved perfect elemental balance, the ultimate expression of their magical existence. Thalassa was safe, sustained by the truth that their elements were meant to be two halves of one essential whole. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving the silence of the altar chamber profound. Kael and Rhys slowly rose from the floor, their rivalry dissolved by the necessity of their combined creation. The continuous, steady hum of the perfectly restored ritual of tides was the new background of their lives. Soon, the elders and key city officials arrived, their expressions shifting from profound relief to awed respect. Thalassa was safe, and the mages were heroes. But the true resolution lay not in the city's gratitude, but in their eyes meeting across the polished surface of the humming altar. Rhys, the stonekeeper, spoke first, his voice stripped of its usual rigidity. "I saw my error, Tidemaster. My instinct for structure was blinding. I created obstacles where I needed to create form. I learned that pure rigidity, without flow, is simply brittleness." Kael the Tidemaster nodded, his usual impatience replaced by deep respect. "And I learned that pure flow, without structure, is simply chaos. I needed your rigidity, Rhys. I needed the boundary to give my flow meaning. I could not create the mire without your willingness to sacrifice your hardness." They realized their fated rivalry, the constant opposition of water and earth, was not a magical fault, but the engine of their synchronization. They were designed as necessary counterbalances. The most stable state was not the absence of conflict, but the perfect, functional tension between their two natures. The shadow plague had severed their psychic link, but their desperate fight to survive had forced them to forge a new, much stronger connection based on professional trust and deep elemental understanding. They knew precisely what the other was capable of, and more importantly, what the other needed to succeed. They stepped together to the altar, their hands rising to touch the surface where their unified mire element now flowed, a quiet, powerful testament to their compromise. They would still clash. Kael would always push for change, and Rhys would always demand discipline. But their conflict would now be channeled into the meticulous maintenance of their new, fragile equilibrium. The Tidemaster would ensure the fluidity required for Thalassa to adapt and live. The Stonekeeper would ensure the structure required for Thalassa to endure and last. Together, they were the perfect mire, sustaining the sunken city's last and now secure breath.